The voicemail came at 2:47 on a Tuesday afternoon. I was wiping down booth 6 at Murphy's Diner in Minneapolis. The lunch rush had finally died down. I had 30 seconds of quiet before the early dinner crowd would start filtering in. My phone buzzed in the pocket of my apron. I almost didn't check it. I almost let it go to voicemail and dealt with it later. The way I dealt with everything in those days. Later, when I had energy, when I had time, when I had room in my heart for one more thing, but something made me reach for it. The voice on the other end belonged to a man I had never spoken to in my life. He sounded older, careful, the way men get when they've spent 40 years choosing their words for a living. He asked if I was Wren Calloway, daughter of Sarah Vogel. Sarah Vogel. I hadn't heard my mother's maiden name spoken aloud in 8 years. Not since the morning the hospice nurse came to tell me my mother had passed in her sleep. The nurse had asked if there was anyone she should call. There wasn't. There hadn't been for a long time. The man on the voicemail said his name was Reeves Patterson. He was an attorney in a town called Pinecrest, Minnesota. He needed to speak with me about a matter of considerable importance. He said my grandfather had passed away 6 months prior. He said there were arrangements that required my attention. A grandfather. I sat down in booth 6. I pressed my back against the cool vinyl. I listened to the message 3 more times before I understood what he was telling me. I had a grandfather. I had family, and he was already gone. My name is Wren Calloway. I was 24 years old that spring of 2008. I had $340 to my name, a studio apartment with a leaking radiator, a job that paid me in tips and free coffee. My mother died when I was 16 after a long illness that drained whatever savings she had managed to put aside. There was no insurance. There was no extended family that I knew of. The state took me in, and the state spit me out 2 years later with a backpack and a voucher for 1 month's rent. I had spent 6 years convincing myself that I didn't need anyone, that I was fine on my own, that the loneliness in my chest was just a feature of my life, like the squeak in my left shoe, or the way my hair refused to lie flat in the morning. I had built a small, careful existence around the absence of family, and I had told myself it was enough. And now a man named Reeves Patterson was telling me that for 24 years, somewhere in northern Minnesota, an old farmer had been thinking about me. I called him back from the alley behind the diner. My hands shook so badly I had to brace the phone against my ear with my shoulder. He answered on the first ring. His voice was kind. He said my grandfather, Silas Vogel, had passed in October of 2007. He said the estate had been waiting for me. He said my grandmother, Adelaide Vogel, was still living, and she had been hoping I would come home. Home. I had never been to Pinecrest, Minnesota in my life. But the way he said the word, the way it landed in my ear like a stone dropping into a deep well, I understood that he meant it the way some people mean it. The way you mean it when a place has been waiting for you, whether you knew it or not. He told me there was a farm, 280 acres, a house built in 1890, a barn older than that. He said there were complications. He said it would be best if I came in person. I asked him how my grandfather had known where to find me after all these years. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said something I have never forgotten. He said, "Miss Calloway, your grandfather spent the last 24 years trying to find you. He found you 6 weeks before he died." I bought a Greyhound ticket that night. Have you ever received a phone call that arrived at exactly the moment you needed it most? A voice from somewhere you didn't expect, offering you a door you didn't know existed? If you have, my friend, then you understand what I felt sitting on that bus the next morning, watching the city give way to fields, watching Minnesota open up around me like a book I had never been allowed to read. Comment below and tell me about your moment, the call, the letter, the stranger who turned out to be family. I read every single one, and I want to hear yours. The bus took 3 hours. I pressed my forehead against the cold window and watched the highway turn into county roads, and the county roads turn into something narrower, something slower. The sky got bigger, the towns got smaller. By the time we pulled into Pinecrest, the air smelled like cut grass and diesel, and something else I couldn't name. Something I would later learn was just the smell of land that had been worked by hand for more than 100 years. Pinecrest was 4,200 people, give or take, according to the sign at the edge of town. Main Street had a diner called Hattie's, a feed store with a hand-painted sign, a Methodist church with a white steeple, a hardware store that looked like it hadn't changed since 1955. Reeves Patterson's law office sat above the bakery, up a flight of wooden stairs that creaked under my feet. He stood up when I walked in. He was older than I had imagined, somewhere past 50, with silver at his temples and reading glasses pushed up on his forehead. He shook my hand with both of his, the way men do when they want you to know they mean it. He told me to sit down. He poured me a cup of coffee from a pot that had been brewing too long. Then he opened a folder on his desk, and he handed me a letter. The envelope was yellow with age, though the postmark was only 2 years old. The handwriting was shaky, the kind of writing that belongs to a hand that has done a lot of work and is starting to feel its years. My name was on the front, just my name, no address. He said my grandfather had written this letter the day he finally found my address. He said my grandfather had carried it in his coat pocket for 6 weeks, intending to mail it. But he wanted to be sure. He wanted to know I would receive it, so he asked Reeves to hold it and to give it to me in person if anything happened to him before I came home. 5 weeks later, my grandfather had a stroke in the kitchen of his farmhouse. He never woke up. I held the envelope in my hands for a long time before I opened it. The paper inside was thin, almost translucent. The handwriting climbed up the page in careful, slow lines. It said, "Wren, I have written you 47 letters over 24 years. They were all returned. Your mother hid you from me well, though I know now she hid you from herself too. I do not blame her. I never did. But I want you to know before anything else that you have been loved. By me. By your grandmother. By a place. We have been waiting for you. The bags will explain everything. Adelaide will show you. Come home, my girl. Come home." It was signed simply, "Your grandfather, Silas." I sat in that office and cried for the first time in 8 years. When I could breathe again, Reeves slid a tissue across the desk and waited. He didn't say anything for a long while. Then he told me there were practical matters. The farm had taxes due, there were debts, there were decisions to be made. But he said all of that could wait. He said the most important thing was that someone was outside in a pickup truck, and he had been waiting for almost an hour, and he would be happy to drive me out to the farm whenever I was ready. His name was Tobias Brennan. Everyone called him Toby. He was 26 years old, with sun-browned forearms and a quiet way of standing, like a man who had spent most of his life listening to land. He took my one small suitcase and put it in the bed of his truck without saying much. He just nodded at me, held the passenger door open, and waited for me to climb in. The drive was 12 miles. The road curved past silos and barns and fields that were just beginning to show the green tips of new wheat. The sun was setting. The whole world looked like someone had poured honey over it. Toby didn't talk much. He pointed out a creek where he had fished as a boy. He pointed out a barn that had been hit by lightning the summer before. When we passed a bend in the road, he slowed down, and he said, "There it is." I looked up. The house stood at the end of a long gravel drive, white painted clapboard against the sky going pink at the edges. The paint was peeling in places. The porch sagged a little on the left side, but it was the kind of house that knew how to stand. The kind of house that had stood through 118 winters and intended to stand through 100 more. Behind it, an enormous barn loomed, the wood weathered to a soft silver. The fields rolled out from the buildings like a quilt, brown and green and gold all at once. Toby pulled into the drive. A figure came out onto the porch, a woman in a blue cardigan, with white hair pulled back in a low knot, her hand at her throat. She didn't move when we stopped. She just stood there, holding herself, watching me get out of the truck. I walked up the porch steps. I didn't know what to say. I had spent 24 years not knowing this woman existed. She spoke first. She said, "You have your mother's eyes." And then she opened her arms, and I stepped into them. And my grandmother held me on that porch for what felt like a very long time. She smelled like flower and lavender and something warm, something like a kitchen at the end of a long day. She didn't cry. She just held me and patted my back the way you pat a child who has come home very late. Her name was Adelaide. She was 68 years old, and for 24 years she had set a place at her table just in case. She made coffee in a percolator that had to be older than I was. She put biscuits on a blue plate and butter in a small white dish. She sat me at the kitchen table and she watched me eat. She asked me about my mother, not the sick years, the good years. She asked if Sarah had been happy, even for a little while. She asked if I remembered her singing. I told her my mother had sung me to sleep every night until I was 12. Old songs about rivers and hills and going home. Adelaide closed her eyes. She said, "Those are the songs my mother sang to her." My friends, if you have ever met family for the first time as a grown woman, you know that strange and shaking feeling. Looking into eyes that hold pieces of your own face, hearing voices that sound like the echoes of voices you have only half remembered. If you have lived through a moment like this, please hit that subscribe button. And tell me below, tell me about the cousin you didn't know you had, the half-sister who knocked on your door, the great aunt who sent a letter out of nowhere. Family is a stranger thing than we ever expect. Share your story, and let's keep going. After supper, when the dishes were done, and the kitchen smelled like dish soap and the last of the coffee, my grandmother put on a heavier sweater. She picked up a kerosene lantern from a hook by the back door. She said there was something she needed to show me before I went to bed. Something my grandfather had wanted me to see first, before anything else on the farm. I followed her out across the yard. The barn rose up in front of us, enormous in the dusk. She slid the great wooden door open, and the smell that came out was the smell of 120 years of grain and oak and dust and time. She lit the lantern and held it up, and she walked me through the dim space toward a smaller door at the back, a door I would never have noticed on my own. She opened it. The room beyond was small and cool. The walls were lined with wooden shelves, and on the shelves, in a careful row, sat 14 heavy canvas bags. They were old. Some looked older than others. The oldest, sitting on the highest shelf, was made of a thick, almost waterproof canvas, stitched with waxed linen thread that had gone dark with age. Each bag had a small handwritten label tied to it with twine. Years, notes, words I couldn't quite read in the lamplight. My grandmother stood in the middle of the room, and she said very softly, "This is your inheritance, sweetheart. This, not the land. Your grandfather said, when the time came, don't give her the farm, give her the bags. The bags are the family." I didn't understand. I stood in that small, cool room, looking at 14 canvas bags of what appeared to be wheat seed, and I did not understand anything. She said she would explain in the morning. She said it was a long story, and it was better told in daylight. She kissed the top of my head, the way you kiss a child, and she led me back to the house. That night, I slept in my mother's old bedroom, in a brass bed under a quilt that smelled like cedar. The window was open a little, and I could hear an owl calling from somewhere out in the fields. I lay in the dark, and I tried to understand how I had gone from wiping down a booth in Minneapolis to sleeping in the bed where my mother had slept as a girl, in a house I had never known, on a farm I now apparently owned. I thought about the bags. I thought about a man I had never met, writing 47 letters into the silence, year after year, hoping one of them would find me. I thought about my mother, sleeping in the same bed at 16, at 17, at 18, and then leaving and never coming back. And somewhere in the long, dark hours of that first night, I made a decision without quite knowing I had made it. I was not going to leave in the morning. I was going to stay long enough to understand, Morning came soft and gray. The smell of bacon brought me down to the kitchen, where Adelaide was already at the stove. She poured me coffee. She put a plate in front of me, and after we had eaten, she took me back out to the seed room, and she began to tell me the story of the bags. She told me about my great-great-grandfather, Heinrich Vogel, who came to Minnesota in 1885 from a farming village in Eastern Europe, carrying a small leather pouch of wheat seed that his own father had given him at the boat. She told me that the Vogel family had farmed the same parcel of land for 123 years. She told me that every year, every single year. My ancestors had walked the fields before harvest, looking for the strongest plants, the ones that bent in the wind without breaking, the ones that survived the rust and the drought and the early frost. They had harvested those plants by hand. They had threshed them separately, and they had mixed those seeds back into the main stock. For 123 years, my family had been quietly building something. Not a uniform crop, not a marketable commodity, something else. Something the agricultural textbooks called a landrace, a living, breathing population of wheat that had been shaped by this exact piece of ground for over a century. She said my grandfather called it Vogel wheat. The neighbors called it stubbornness. My great-uncle, who had run off to Chicago in the 1950s, had called it foolishness. But it was, she said, the only thing of true value the family had ever made. She said my grandfather had wanted me to understand the bags before I understood anything else, because the bags were the reason he had spent 24 years writing letters to a granddaughter he had never met. He had wanted someone to inherit them. He had wanted someone to carry them on. I asked her why my mother had left. Adelaide was quiet for a long moment. She ran her hand along the rough canvas of one of the bags. Then she told me. In 1982, when my mother was 19 years old, she had fallen in love with a young man passing through town. He was charming and restless and had no intention of staying anywhere for long. My grandfather had not approved. There had been a fight. There had been words said in the heat of the moment that no one in that kitchen had ever known how to take back. My mother had left in the middle of the night. She had taken a bus to Chicago, then to Milwaukee, then to Minneapolis. The young man was gone within a year. My mother had me alone in 1984, and she had been too proud or too ashamed or too afraid to come home. My grandfather had searched for her 3 times: Chicago, Milwaukee, Minneapolis. He had walked the streets with a photograph. He had checked phone books. He had asked at hospitals and shelters and churches. He never found her. My mother had moved every 6 months, sometimes more often. By the time my grandfather had any solid lead, she was gone again. Adelaide said, "She loved you so much, sweetheart. That's why she ran so far. She thought she was protecting you from us, from what she thought was waiting for her here. She didn't know." "She didn't know what?" Adelaide said. "She didn't know that her father had forgiven her the morning after she left. She didn't know that he sat at this kitchen table and wept and said he would have given her anything, anything in the world. If only she would come home. She thought he was angry. He wasn't. He was heartbroken." I sat down on the floor of the seed room. I sat down right there on the cold wooden boards, between the shelves of bags, and I cried for my mother. I cried for the girl she had been. I cried for the woman she had become, who had been dying of pride and silence as much as she had been dying of any illness. And I cried for the old man who had spent the last quarter of his life writing letters into the dark. When I could breathe, my grandmother helped me up. She said there was something else she wanted to show me. She said if I was ready, I said I was ready. We went up to the second floor, to the room that had been my mother's. Adelaide knelt down by the window, and she pulled up a loose floorboard with her fingertips. Underneath in the dust was a small wooden box made of oak. She took it out. She set it on the bed. She said, "He kept these here because he wanted them close to her room. He said if she ever came home, he wanted her to find them first." I opened the box. 47 letters, each one in its own envelope, each one stamped, each one addressed to me at an address that had long since been wrong. Each one stamped in faded red ink, return to sender, address unknown. The first letter was from 1984, the year I was born. The handwriting was younger, stronger. He had written to introduce himself. He had written to say he loved me, even though he had never seen my face. The last letter was from 2007, 6 months before he died. The handwriting was so shaky I could barely read it. It said, Wren, I am running out of time. I do not know if these letters reach you in any form, in any world, but I want you to know that I tried, that every birthday, every Christmas, every spring when the wheat came up, I thought of you. I do not know what your life has been. I hope it has been kind. If it has not, please come home. There is a place for you here. There has always been a place. 47 letters, 24 years of trying. My friends, if you have ever wondered whether you were loved by someone who could not reach you, I want you to remember this moment with me. Hit that subscribe button if Wren's story is moving you tonight. And tell me below, have you ever found letters that never made it home? A box in an attic? A bundle in a drawer? Someone tried somewhere to reach you. Tell me about it. Your story might be the thing that helps another woman watching tonight believe that she was loved too. I read all 47 letters that day. I sat on my mother's bed with the late afternoon sun coming through the window, and I read them in order, from the first to the last. I learned about my grandfather through his own words. I learned that he was a quiet man who loved bad puns. I learned that he had a knee that ached before storms. I learned that he had taught himself to play the harmonica during the winter of 1991 because Adelaide had been sick, and he needed to do something with his hands while he sat by her bed. I learned that he had loved my mother more than he had ever known how to say. And I learned slowly, in the careful, slow climb of his handwriting through the years, that he had loved me too. By the time I finished the last letter, the sun had gone down. Adelaide came up with a plate of soup and sat with me. She didn't say anything. She just sat. After a long while, she said, he used to read them out loud to me before he sealed them. He said writing them was the closest he could come to hearing your voice. That was the night I decided I was not going back to Minneapolis. I didn't know yet how I was going to stay. I didn't know yet how I was going to make a life on a farm I didn't know how to run. I didn't know about the taxes that were owed, or the man who would come the following week with an offer that would seem too good to refuse. But I knew I was not leaving. I knew that the wooden box of letters was now mine, and the bags in the barn were now mine, and the grandmother who had waited 24 years for me to come home was now mine. And I knew that I had spent 6 years telling myself I didn't need anyone, and I had been wrong about that the whole time. The week that followed was strange and slow and full of small wonders. I learned the shape of the farm. I learned where the well was, and how the back porch caught the morning sun, and how the barn cats appeared like ghosts at feeding time and disappeared again into the hayloft. I learned that Toby Brennan came by every other day to check on Adelaide, the way he had been doing since my grandfather died. I learned that Adelaide woke at 5:30 in the morning and could not be persuaded otherwise. I learned that she made bread on Wednesdays and Saturdays, and that the kitchen on a Wednesday morning was perhaps the closest thing to heaven I had ever stood in. I also began to understand the trouble I was in. It came in the form of a man named Lawson Halloway, who pulled into the gravel drive on a Thursday morning in a silver pickup truck so new it still had the dealer's plates. He was 33 years old, in a pressed shirt and a leather jacket, with a folder under his arm. He smiled when he saw me. He smiled the way men smile when they think they already know how a conversation is going to go. He introduced himself as the manager of the Pinecrest cooperative grain terminal. He said he had known my grandfather. He said he was very sorry for my loss. He said he wanted to talk to me about my future on the farm. If I had a minute, I had a minute. He sat at the kitchen table. Adelaide brought him coffee, but she did not sit down with us. She stood at the counter, and she watched him with a face I did not yet know how to read. He told me my situation was difficult. He said the farm carried debts, $42,000 in back taxes, equipment loans, and operating fees that had piled up in the months since my grandfather's death. He said the bank would not extend credit indefinitely. He said the property could be foreclosed within 90 days if the debts were not cleared. He said he wanted to help. He pulled a contract out of his folder. He slid it across the table. He had an offer prepared, he said. $850,000 for the entire 280 acres. The house, the barn, all of it. A fair price, he said. A clean break. I could pay off my mother's debts. I could go home with more money than I had ever seen in my life. I could start over. He smiled at me. He said, "Yo, you don't owe this place anything, Miss Calloway. You didn't grow up here. There's no shame in walking away." I did not say anything for a long time. I looked at the contract. I looked at the kitchen. I looked at the back door, through which I could see the corner of the barn. Then I looked at my grandmother. Her face had gone very still. I told Mr. Halloway that I appreciated his offer. I told him I would need time to think. He said, of course. He said he would be in touch. He said the bank had its own timeline, but he was sure we could work something out before the deadline. He left the contract on the table. He put on his jacket. He thanked Adelaide for the coffee. And he walked out into the morning like a man who had no doubt at all about how this was going to end. I watched his truck go down the drive. When it disappeared around the bend, Adelaide finally spoke. She said, "He came to your grandfather 4 times. 4 times in the last 3 years of his life, with contracts, with offers, each one bigger than the last. Your grandfather refused him every time." I asked her why. She said, because Lawson Halloway doesn't want to farm this land. He wants to flatten it. He has a plan. He wants to build a bulk grain terminal here. He would tear down the house. He would tear down the barn. He would scrape away every last seed, and he would pour concrete over 123 years of family, and he would call it progress. She looked at me. She said, your grandfather said no to him, and Lawson Halloway never forgave him for it. Now he thinks the granddaughter from the city will be easier. My friends, we are at the heart of this story now. If Wren's journey is touching you the way it has been touching me, please hit that subscribe button. We share stories of hope, of finding home, of love that waits across decades. And tell me below in the comments, what would you do? $850,000 in your hand, and a debt you didn't make hanging over a place you've only known for 1 week. Would you sell the farm and walk away? Or would you find a way to fight for a legacy you never knew you had? Tell me what you would do. I want to know. That evening, Tobias Brennan came by. He had heard that Halloway had been to the farm. He didn't ask how the meeting had gone. He just sat on the porch with me, and he watched the light go out of the western sky. And after a long while, he started to talk. He told me he had grown up 2 farms over. He told me his mother had died when he was 14, and his father had not known how to be a father after that. He told me my grandfather had been the man who had taught him how to drive a tractor, how to read the weather, how to know when the wheat was ready. He told me that in the last year of my grandfather's life, when Silas had been too tired to walk the fields alone, Toby had walked them with him. He said my grandfather had talked about me in those long, slow walks. He had told Toby everything he could remember about his daughter Sarah. He had said, I think she had a girl. I have always thought she had a girl. Toby looked at me. He said, he hoped you'd come, Miss Calloway. He hoped right up to the end. I asked him what he thought I should do. He didn't answer right away. He looked out at the fields, which were almost dark now. Then he said, Halloway isn't a bad man. I want you to know that. He believes in what he believes in. He thinks he's right. He thinks bigger and faster is better. He thinks the small farmer is a museum piece. And he genuinely believes he is doing this county a favor by buying us up one at a time. He paused. But your grandfather didn't agree. And I don't agree. And if you give me a chance, I would like to show you why. He stood up. He said good night. He said he would be back in the morning if I wanted to walk the fields with him. I told him I did. That night I lay awake again. I thought about the contract on the kitchen table. I thought about $850,000. I thought about what that money could mean. A house of my own, a car that started in the winter, a future without the constant low hum of fear that had been my background music since I was 16. I thought about the bags. I thought about my grandfather's last letter. I got out of bed at 1 in the morning. I went down to the kitchen in my socks. I picked up the contract. I read it through, every clause, every line, and then I carried it out to the barn, and I sat on the cold wooden floor of the seed room, surrounded by 14 canvas bags older than my entire life, and I read my grandfather's words to myself by the light of my phone. There is a place for you here. There has always been a place. I put the contract down on the floor. I picked up a small handful of seed from one of the open bags. I let it run through my fingers. The grains were not uniform. Some were dark, some were light, some were plump, some were narrow. They did not match. They did not sort. They were 123 years of refusing to be the same. I sat there a long time. I thought about my mother. I thought about how she had spent her whole life believing she didn't belong anywhere. I thought about how that belief had eaten her, slowly, year after year, until there was nothing left. And I thought, very quietly, very clearly, that I was not going to do that to myself. But here is the part I have to tell you honestly, my friends. The part I am not proud of. That night I almost left. I want to be honest with you. I want you to know how close I came to walking away. I went back inside, I climbed the stairs, and I packed my bag at 1:30 in the morning. I sat on the edge of my mother's old brass bed with the small canvas duffel I had brought from Minneapolis. And I put my few clothes back into it. And I picked up my phone to call a taxi to take me to the bus station the next morning. The fear had come for me. The cold, practical fear that whispers in the middle of the night that you are foolish to dream, foolish to stay, foolish to believe that anything good will come of refusing $850,000 to chase a story about a man you never met. I held the phone in my hand for a long time. Then I heard it, a small sound from the room next door. My grandmother, awake, in her own bed, weeping very quietly, the way a woman weeps when she is trying not to be heard. She had heard me packing. She thought I was leaving. I sat on the edge of the bed, and I listened to a 68-year-old woman cry alone in the dark for a granddaughter she had only just met. And I understood that I had a choice to make that I could not unmake. I could go back to Minneapolis with $850,000 in my pocket, or I could stay, and I could be the answer to 24 years of waiting. I unpacked the bag. I unpacked it slowly, one thing at a time. I put each item back where it had been, and then I sat on the edge of the bed and I listened until my grandmother's weeping quieted, and then stopped, and then turned, somewhere in the long quiet, into sleep. To my friends watching tonight, especially those of you who have lain awake at midnight with a packed bag and a fear in your chest, you know what that moment feels like. The moment when staying is harder than leaving, when believing is harder than running. Comment below and tell me about your midnight. Tell me about the bag you almost packed. Tell me about the choice you almost didn't make. Your courage tonight is somebody else's hope. In the morning, I walked into her kitchen and I told her I was staying. I watched her face change, the way the morning sky changes when the sun finally comes over the eastern fields. She did not say anything for a moment. She just turned around very slowly from the stove. She put down her wooden spoon. She came across the kitchen, and she took my face in her flour-dusted hands. She said, "Oh, sweetheart, oh, my girl." She did not cry, but her hands shook a little against my cheeks, and that was enough. I called my old landlady in Minneapolis later that morning, Mrs. Petrov, who had rented me the studio above her hardware store for 2 years, and who had never once raised the rent. I told her I was not coming back. I told her she could keep what little furniture I owned. I told her I would send for my books in a few weeks. When things were settled, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said in her thick Polish accent, "Good for you, Wren. A young woman should have somewhere to belong." She hung up, and just like that, the small life I had built in the city was over. Adelaide and I sat at the kitchen table. The contract was still sitting between the salt and the pepper shakers. I asked her what we were going to do about the $42,000. She said she didn't know. She said my grandfather had taken out a small operating loan in the spring of 2007, expecting to pay it back at harvest, and then he had died, and the loan had quietly grown teeth. She said the taxes had been a steady weight for years. She said there was about $8,000 in savings, and that was the whole of what we had to work with. $8,000 against $42,000 of debt. 90 days. A planting season we had not yet planted. I said, then we plant. Adelaide looked at me. She said, Wren, sweetheart, you don't know how to farm. I said, then teach me. That was the beginning of the strangest, most beautiful spring of my life. Toby came every morning at sunrise. He had taken a leave from his own work to help us, and he would not accept any payment beyond breakfast and dinner. He said he owed my grandfather more than money could repay. He showed me how to ride the old tractor, the one from 1976 that started on the third try if you knew exactly which way to wiggle the choke. He showed me how to read the soil. He showed me how to pour the seed from the canvas bags into the planter. I watched my hands learn things they had never been asked to do. I watched my grandmother stand at the edge of the field on the first morning of planting, in her blue cardigan, holding a cup of coffee against her chest. And I watched her cry for the first time since I had arrived. She said, your grandfather is here. He is right here watching us. I believed her. We planted 200 acres that spring, not the full crop the farm could carry. We didn't have the money for the seed treatments or the fuel that a complete planting would require, and Toby and I had to nurse the old equipment along through every long day. But we planted enough to bring in a real harvest if everything went right, enough to pay the debt, enough to keep the farm. Lawson Halloway came back twice during planting, once to check in, once to deliver a revised offer. This one $900,000 with a 60-day deadline. He smiled less the second time. He looked, I thought, a little tired. I told him no on the porch. I did not invite him in for coffee. He drove away faster than he had come. The summer came on hot. Hotter than usual, Adelaide said. The rain that should have come in June did not come. The rain that should have come in July did not come. The fields around us, the fields planted in the modern uniform varieties that everyone in the county had been buying. Those fields began to look thin, pale. The wheat was not growing the way it should have. Our field was different. Our field was patchy and uneven and a little bit chaotic. Some of the wheat was tall, some was short, some had headed out early, some was still sending up tillers. To the eye of a modern agronomist, our field was a mess. To my grandfather's eye, my grandmother said, our field was insurance. She walked the rows with me in the evenings, and she showed me what to look for. She showed me the plants with the deeper roots, the ones that had reached down into the cool subsoil for water that the shallower-rooted modern varieties could not reach. She showed me the plants with the waxy leaves, the ones that conserved moisture in the heat. She showed me the plants that had ripened a full week early, and the ones that were taking their time. She said, your grandfather used to say, what survives is what bends. What is rigid breaks. She said his father had said the same thing, and his father before him. By August, the county was hurting. Yields were going to be down badly. The corn was rolled up in the daytime, leaves curled tight against the sun. The pastures were brown. The big commercial wheat farms were going to bring in something. But it was going to be thin and stressed and short. Our field, my friends, was alive. It was not a perfect field. It was not what a textbook would have called a successful crop. But it was alive. It was coping. It was doing what 123 years of careful, patient breeding had taught it how to do. And in mid-October, on a morning that smelled like dust and ripeness, Toby and I climbed into the cab of my grandfather's old combine, and we began to bring in the harvest. Did you feel that, my friends? The strength of standing where someone said you would fail? The quiet pride of bringing in something the world had told you couldn't be brought in? Hit that like button if you're cheering for Wren tonight. And tell me, in the comments below, have you ever stood up for something everyone said was wrong and watched it turn out right? I want to hear your story. Tell me when you were the one who bent and didn't break. We brought in 54 bushels to the acre. Adelaide stood at the edge of the field while the combine chewed its way through the last row. And when I climbed down from the cab, I saw her cross herself, very quickly, the way her grandmother had taught her in another country 100 years before. The grain went into the bins behind the barn. All of it. I would not let any of it go to the cooperative until I had to. I had decided that somewhere deep inside myself, without being able to say exactly why, I called the cooperative on a Tuesday morning in late October. I said I had wheat to deliver. They told me to bring the first truck on Thursday. Toby drove. I sat in the passenger seat. Adelaide stayed home, claiming she had baking to do, but I knew she could not bear to come. The cooperative looked exactly like Lawson Halloway's office had told me it would. A great steel tower, a scale, a small clean office with a window of tinted glass. The automated probe descended into our truck with a hiss, and our wheat was sucked up into the sampling tube. And somewhere in that little office, a machine that cost more than my grandfather had earned in a decade was deciding the fate of 123 years of my family's work. Lawson Halloway came out himself. He had a printout. He was not smiling. He told me my wheat had failed the consistency test. The protein varied too widely. The falling number was inconsistent. The sample was not uniform enough to blend with the rest of the cooperative's grain. He said he could not pay full price. He said he could perhaps offer a salvage price, $2 a bushel under market, but he would have to dock it heavily, and at that point I would barely cover the fuel. He said, "I told you, Miss Calloway, the market wants uniformity. Your grandfather's wheat doesn't deliver uniformity. It never did." I looked at him. I looked at the printout. Then I looked past him, at the rest of the trucks lined up in the lot, at the men in baseball caps watching from a distance. I said, "Mr. Halloway, please put my wheat back in my truck." He blinked. I said, "I am not selling it to you. Not today. Not at any price." He stared at me. He said, "Miss Calloway, this is your harvest. This is your only chance to make the debt. If you walk away now, you lose the farm in 30 days. I said, "I understand." I climbed back into the truck. Toby looked at me. He didn't say anything. He just put the truck in gear, and we made the long, slow turn out of the cooperative lot, past every man watching, and we drove back to the farm with the harvest still in the bed. I did not know yet what I was going to do. I only knew that I was not going to give 123 years of my family to a man who had been waiting 4 years to grind it into concrete. We drove the harvest home. We unloaded it, all of it, into the old wooden barn. The bins were not enough to hold it all. So we cleared the central bay of the barn, and we ran an auger through the great open door, and we built a slow gold mountain of wheat in the place where my grandfather had once parked the tractor. It took 3 days. Toby and I worked from dawn until after dark. Adelaide brought us food and coffee. By the end, my arms ached so badly I could not lift them above my head. I stood in the barn doorway on the third night and looked at it. A mountain of wheat. The whole harvest. 10,000 bushels of grain. Sitting in a barn that had been built in 1890 by hands I would never know. I had bet everything. The bank called the next week. They were polite. They reminded me of the deadline. They said they understood I had taken in a harvest, and they would like to know my plans for repayment. I told them I was working on it. They said they would be in touch. I had 31 days. October ended. November came. The leaves went brown, and then they were gone. The wind out of the north got teeth in it. Adelaide and I stayed close to the wood stove in the evenings. I read my grandfather's letters again, slowly, 2 or 3 each night, And I felt him sitting in the kitchen with us, in his own particular silence. The first phone call came on the 2nd of November. It was a man named Boone McKinney. He owned the largest dairy operation in 3 counties. He had 8,500 head. He had been buying his feed grain from the Pinecrest cooperative for 15 years, and he had a problem. He said his cattle were getting sick. He said his veterinarian had traced the trouble to the feed. He said the cooperative grain, the grain that the rest of the county had grown that summer, had something wrong with it. The drought stress had weakened the wheat, and a fungus had gotten into it, and the grain was not safe for his cows. He said he was calling because he had heard, through the long, quiet pipeline of the county, that I had walked away from the cooperative with my whole crop intact. He said, "Miss Calloway, is your wheat still in the barn?" I said it was. He said, "I'd like to come look at it if you'd let me. I knew your grandfather. I knew him a long time." He came the next morning. He drove up in an old Ford, not a new one. He was 62, weathered, with hands the size of dinner plates. He took off his cap when Adelaide opened the door. He stood on the porch in his stocking feet, because he didn't want to track barn dirt into her kitchen. He said, "Mrs. Vogel, I'm so sorry about Silas. He was the finest man I ever knew." Adelaide pressed her hand to her mouth. She said, "Boone, come in, please." We sat at the kitchen table. He told us a story. He told us that in the winter of 1962, his father had been about to lose the McKinney farm. The bank was going to take it. The whole place, the herd, the land, the house. Boone had been 17 years old, and he had been planning to leave school to work full-time, and he had been certain his family was finished. My grandfather had walked over the hill one cold January morning. He had brought a bag of seed. He had brought another bag of money, a small bag, as much as he had been able to put together. He had stood in the McKinney kitchen, and he had told Boone's father that they would figure it out together. He had not asked for anything in return. He had said that was what neighbors did. The McKinney farm had survived. The herd had grown. Boone had taken it over in 1981. He had become one of the largest dairy operators in the upper Midwest. He said, "I have been waiting 46 years to repay your grandfather. Will you let me?" I asked what he meant. He said he wanted to test my wheat. If it was clean, he wanted to buy it. All of it. At a price that would make the cooperative weep. I said yes. He pulled a small testing kit from his truck. He took a sample from the mountain in the barn. He ran the tests on the tailgate of his truck while Adelaide and I watched, holding hands, not breathing. The results came back. Clean. Below detectable limits. The drought-stressed monoculture wheat all over the county had been compromised. My grandfather's chaotic, patient, 123-year-old landrace, with its deep roots and its waxy leaves and its stubborn refusal to be the same as everyone else, had come through the same drought without the stress that had let the trouble in. Boone looked up at me from the tailgate of his truck. He said, "Miss Calloway, what do you want for it?" I told him $15 a bushel. The market price of clean wheat was around $7.20 a bushel, but the market price did not apply to my wheat, and Boone and I both knew it. There was almost no clean feed grain to be found in the upper Midwest that fall. His cows were sick. His business was on the line. Boone McKinney did not flinch. He looked at me. This 24-year-old waitress from Minneapolis who had come into a farm she didn't know how to run. And he understood, I think, what I was selling. I was not selling wheat. I was selling 123 years of decisions made by people I would never meet. I was selling the work of my grandfather. I was selling the only piece of my mother I would ever fully own. He said, $14.50, and I'll take every bushel you have. I said, done. He wrote me a check on the hood of his truck. The pen scratched across the paper. Adelaide held my hand so tightly I lost feeling in my fingers. Toby stood at the corner of the porch with his hat in his hands. The November wind moved through the bare branches of the oak tree in the front yard, and a check was placed in my hand for $145,000. I did not say anything. Boone shook my hand. He drove away. I sat down on the porch step. I did not cry. I did not laugh. I just sat. After a long while, Adelaide sat down next to me. She put her arm around my shoulders. She said, "Your grandfather is dancing right now, sweetheart. Wherever he is dancing." I went into town the next morning. I paid the back taxes. I paid the operating loan. I paid every last dollar the farm owed to anyone, anywhere. The man at the bank looked at me as if I had grown a second head. He asked me in a careful voice if I would like to discuss investment opportunities for the remaining funds. I said no. I said I would never be needing the bank services again. I drove home, and I sat in the kitchen with my grandmother, and we did not say much. We didn't have to. There was a check stub on the table between us. There was a list of paid debts. There was a future that 2 days ago had not existed. Lawson Halloway came back at the end of November. He did not come with a contract. He came with his hat in his hands. He stood on the porch in the cold. And he said he had heard about the McKinney sale. He said the cooperative was in trouble. He said he had lost more than half his customers. He said he had been wrong, and he had come to say so. He did not ask me to forgive him. He did not ask for help. He just said it. Then he turned to leave. I stopped him. I told him I would sell him a small portion of seed, not the wheat. Seed. Enough for him to plant a trial plot the next spring, enough for him to begin to understand what my grandfather had been doing for the last 40 years. I would sell it to him at a fair price. He looked at me. He said, "Why?" I said, "Because my grandfather would have." I think that was the first time I really understood what it meant to be a Vogel. It was the first time I understood the bags. The bags were not about wheat. They were about the choice my family had made, generation after generation, to plant something that would feed the people around them, even the ones who had been wrong, even the ones who had hurt them. The bags were about a long, slow, stubborn faith in the idea that a place could be made better, season by season, by people who refused to give up on it. Lawson Halloway nodded. He did not smile, he just nodded, and he went down the porch steps, and he drove home. Forgiveness, my friends, is the hardest gift to give. Wren did not have to help Lawson, but she did, because her grandfather had taught her, through 47 letters in 14 canvas bags, that bitterness is a poison we drink hoping someone else will suffer. Comment below if you have ever forgiven someone who didn't deserve it. Your story tonight might be the thing that helps another woman, watching this very late, finally let go of something she has been holding too long. And the very last surprise of that long, strange autumn came on a quiet Saturday morning in the first week of December. Adelaide led me down into the cellar of the farmhouse, into a corner I had not yet explored, and she pulled an old canvas tarp off something wooden and small. It was a cradle made of white oak, hand-carved, with little wheat heads etched into the sides, and a single word written in pencil on the underside, in my grandfather's handwriting. The word was Wren. Adelaide said, "He made this for you the year your mother left. He thought she would come home pregnant. He thought she would come home with a baby. When she didn't, he hid the cradle down here. And he said, one day she will come, and her child will sleep in this." He never stopped believing it. I sat down on the cellar floor with my arms around the cradle, and I cried in a way I have never cried in my life. Not for grief, not exactly. For the sheer enormity of having been believed in. For 24 years I had not known, and for 24 years an old man I had never met had been carving a cradle, writing letters, walking fields, and waiting. My friends, I want you to take a breath right now. I want you to think about someone in your life who believed in you when you couldn't see it. A grandmother, a teacher, a stranger on a bus who said a kind word at the right moment. They are the cradle in the cellar of your life. They are the proof that you were always loved, even when you didn't know. Subscribe to this channel if Wren's story has touched you tonight, and in the comments below, I want you to name them. The person who carved a cradle for you and waited, just their first name. Let's fill the comments tonight with the names of the people who never stopped believing. The spring came on slowly that year. The snow melted in pieces. The fields turned dark and wet, and then, slowly, green. I planted my first full crop in April of 2009. Adelaide stood at the edge of the field on the morning we began, in her blue cardigan, in the same place she had stood the year before. Toby drove the tractor for the first round, and then he climbed down, and he said, "Your turn, Wren. It's your farm." I climbed up into the cab. I set the planter into the earth. I dropped Vogel wheat into Vogel ground, and I felt my grandfather's hand on the wheel beside mine. And I understood for the first time exactly what he had been trying to tell me in his last letter. He had not been giving me a farm. He had been giving me a way of being in the world, a way of bending and not breaking, a way of being patient, a way of trusting the land and the seed and the long, slow work of people who came before you, a way of refusing to be uniform when the world demanded uniformity, and refusing to be bitter when the world demanded bitterness, and refusing, at the end of every long day, to give up on the people who had hurt you. He had given me, in those 14 canvas bags, 123 years of a family I had not known I had. The summer of 2009 was kinder than the summer of 2008. The rain came when it should have. The wheat grew tall and chaotic and beautiful. We brought in a strong harvest in October, and we sold it to Boone McKinney and to 2 other dairy operations he had introduced us to, and we kept seed enough for another year, and enough to begin selling in small, careful amounts to other farmers in the county who had begun to ask questions. Adelaide and I started a small business that fall. We called it Vogel Heritage Seed. We did not advertise, we did not need to. By the summer of 2010, we had farmers from 3 states writing to ask if we would sell to them. By 2012, when another drought rolled through the upper Midwest and did to the modern monocultures what the 2008 drought had done, we were selling seed to 12 farms. By 2015, 50. By the time my grandmother passed away, peacefully in her own bed, on a snowy morning in January of 2018, our seed was being grown in 7 states, and the Pinecrest cooperative had built a special bin just for Vogel wheat. And Lawson Halloway, who had become, against all odds, something like a friend, was on the cooperative's board championing the cause of crop diversity. Toby asked me to marry him on a summer evening in 2014, at the corner of the upper field, where my grandfather had once leaned on a fence post and told him that he hoped, more than anything, that I would come home one day. I said yes. We had our daughter Adelaide Sarah Brennan in the spring of 2016. We named her for both of her grandmothers, the one she got to know and the one she didn't. She slept her first nights in the white oak cradle. I want to tell you, my friends, that my life has been simple since the day I came home to Pinecrest. I want to tell you that the work has been easy, and the years have been gentle. They have not been. There have been hard winters. There have been losses. There have been moments when I have stood at the edge of the field at sunset and wondered if I had been a fool after all to walk away from $850,000. But I have never, not once, regretted my answer. I came to Pinecrest with $340 and no family. I stayed because I finally understood what my grandfather meant when he wrote that the bags were the legacy, and not the land. The bags were us. They were every Vogel who had ever planted, every Vogel who had ever watched a storm come in over the western hills, every Vogel who had ever picked up a handful of grain at the end of a long day and let it run through their fingers, and felt for one quiet moment that they were exactly where they were supposed to be. The bags were my great-great-grandfather, who carried them across an ocean. The bags were my grandmother, who waited 24 years for a granddaughter she had never seen. The bags were my grandfather, who wrote 47 letters and never stopped believing one of them would be answered. The bags were my mother, who left, but who had also planted the longing in me to find a way home. The bags were me. And now when my daughter is old enough to understand, the bags will be hers. My dear friends, thank you for staying with me tonight. Thank you for sitting through this long story with an open heart. If this story moved you, if it made you remember someone, if it reminded you that love finds a way across decades and across miles and across silences that we thought were permanent, please subscribe to this channel. We share stories like Wren's. We share stories of finding home, of finding family in unexpected places, of love that waits as long as it has to. In the comments below, I want to ask you something, and I want you to think about it before you answer. Have you ever found home in a place you didn't expect to find it? Have you ever discovered that someone loved you all along, even when you didn't know? Tell me. Tell me their name. Tell me what they did or didn't do or said or wrote that finally reached you. Even if it took years, your story tonight might be the thing that helps another woman watching believe that she too was loved all along. Until next time, my friends, until the next story we share together, remember this and carry it with you tonight. You are loved. You always were. You always will be. Good night, my friends, and welcome home.